I now look to Dr. Andrews to close the case for the proposition.
All right, so thank you for the invitation, thank you for coming. I wasn't going to start here, but I've heard a lot of things in my time, and believe me, Bob Marley will be on this side of the aisle. All right, I just want to say that 100%, and I explain why. All right, first thing first, in terms of this motion, is racism. Racism is not about individual prejudice. Racism is not about the individual white teacher who says bad things. I've been called a nigger probably 3 times by white people. Every single time I left. Why? There was no power. It was meaningless to me, right? And let's take a key case, Stephen Lawrence, right? Stephen Lawrence was killed by racists, but that wasn't what made it racism. The act itself was prejudice. What made it racism was how the police responded. Because he was black, they didn't do their job. And 20 years later, we have to still fight for justice. Racism is about power. It is about structures. And that is how we have to analyze it. Not in terms of individual prejudice and these ideas, not in terms of it's in terms of numbers, in terms of inequalities, in terms of unemployment, it's in terms of university inequalities, which are actually worse than school inequalities, right? And when we look at this, and we look at the society as a whole, I'm reminded of what Malcolm X said, not when he came here actually, it was a year after he came here. He said that the West, America, Britain, can no more provide freedom, justice, and equality than a chicken can lay a duck egg. And that's important. Racism is at the DNA, is at the heart of this country. We say Britain is, of course Britain is racist. That's the most obvious thing you could ever say. Britain is not only racist, it is built on racism and perpetuates racism on a daily basis, right? The 3 pillars of this country are genocide, slavery, and colonialism. That's a story you won't hear, but it is the truth. All of the wealth, this wonderfully esteemed place we are in today, is built on genocide, slavery, and colonialism. It is maintained on colonialism. It is maintained on racism. And as has already been said today by the other side, I think it was, the school system, what's the role of the school system? Is to perpetuate the society. So once you show indisputably that Britain is based on racism, then the school system can only perpetuate racism because this is the purpose of the school system. And this is really important to separate education from schooling. Now I agree, education is wonderful. I love education. But schooling is a different thing. And what you get from nursery, primary school, secondary school, university, that is schooling. It is a system which is meant to control you. It is a system which is meant to perpetuate the inequalities in society. The venerable colleagues that the opposition mentioned here, Nkrumah, you could mention George Padmore, all these revolutionaries, they may have been schooled in a colonial system, they were educated outside of it. And they were educated to understand that that system can never provide freedom, justice, and equality in the same way that a chicken can never lay a duck egg. So let's look at the school system. Let's look at the school system, right? And let's look at the inequalities in the school system. Has it got any better? Now, in some ways, you can look at the stats and say this improvements, that improvements. Other ways, however, let's look at exclusions. Let's look at attainment. But let's actually shift the focus to here, to the university, as I said. I mean, you've got all these wonderful cases of students, Indian students, Chinese students doing really, really well in schools. Guess what? They come to universities like this university, if they can get in. And what happens? The biggest inequality in schooling now is in the gap between white students are far more likely to get a 2-1 in the first than non-white students, even if they come in with all this wonderful schooling, right? What does that tell you? That tells you it's an institutional problem. Dr. Du Bois said quite profoundly, a system can never defend the people it was not supposed to protect. The point of schooling has never been to make it more easier for people like me to succeed. The point of schooling has always been to make it much more difficult for us to succeed. And I'm going to give you a Marxist philosopher, Ivan Illich, who talked about schooling society. And this is something we need to shake from our minds. The idea that universal schooling was meant to make things more equal. No. Universal schooling came in because of the economy, the structure of the work, etc., etc. That's the point of it, right? This is how you can tell what the role of the school is. 50 years ago, you had all these wonderful working class jobs. You didn't need skills. You didn't need to read and write. It was wonderful, right? In those times, only 5%, 3%, 4% of people went to university. Places like Oxford could be happily monocultural because it didn't really matter, right? 50 years later, you need a skilled workforce. You need people with degrees. So the unwashed masses, the dark people, the poor people, they're invited in. not so much to hear, but they're invited in more generally, right? That's the role of schooling. So this doesn't mean everything's got better, it doesn't mean anything's changed. Look at the system, look at unemployment. Even if you get your degree and you're black or Asian, you're much less likely to be employed, right? Look at the inequalities. They are still there, they are still just as bad. And what we should never do, and this is the point where Illich is talking about with credentials, right? So what this does is, giving out credentials, everybody has universal education, that actually makes it worse, because now you are justified in your place. I have a PhD, I therefore should get a good job. If you don't have a PhD, if you don't have 5 GCSEs, and you're fair enough. Of course you don't deserve to have a good job. Of course you don't deserve to be in a place of esteem. So we hand out these credentials, but hang on a second, the credentials they're not gained fairly. Much more difficult if you're working class, certainly. And no one would say that working class have it easy in the school system. Of course they don't. And they never have either. This idea that this is something new, that somehow working class boys, this white working class has skipped through, nonsense. It's always been the case. Because guess what? The system is also classist, but it's very, very racist as well, right? So once you hand out these credentials, you're stuck. So I was a young man, came to my university from a poor background, black boy, got a first, came out, I got a first in business, I'm applying for this internship, can't get on the internship because he did a BTEC. BTEC means you can't do that. That credential means you can't get on the internship, right? Your UCAS points are now more important than your actual university qualifications. That is sedimenting inequality. That's what schooling does. So please don't tell me that things have improved or got any better. An important part of this debate, So an important part of this to also then think about, because this happens a lot, right? I'm black, I'm African Caribbean boy. I'm an African Caribbean boy from Birmingham who went to a pretty terrible school. But look, I've made it, right? I'm here with my nice suit on in Oxford, I'm a professor, blah, 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 right? But that's the wrong attitude, right? This is not about the few of us. Because the credentials are more difficult for black people and poor people, etc., to get, that doesn't mean the system has somehow got better. It doesn't mean the system has somehow improved, right? Because there's a few more black people in higher places, doesn't mean the system has improved. Because actually for most people who look like me, the unemployment rate for people who look like me in Birmingham is 50%. Young black Caribbean boys in Birmingham, 50% unemployment. That's crisis level. That's third world level unemployment in our cities in this country. So please do not tell me that anything has got any better. So we should never look at the few and say, well, look, the few, that's great, it's great, right? No, because the way that the British school system has always worked is to give privilege to the few. Not so much in the UK at first, right? But remember, when we think about Britain, Britain is not an island with 4 countries or 5 or how many countries it is now. It is an empire, British Empire. And this model of giving the few a bit of access, a bit of success, a bit of nice clothes and fine schooling, that's a way of colonial control. I mean, this rose-tinted look back at the colonial education is somewhat galling, to be honest, actually. This idea that, it's better in the past, and it's like, no, please no. Because actually what the point of this schooling was, for the colonial elite, everybody in Jamaica didn't get schooled. Everybody in Jamaica now doesn't get schooled. You go half the day into school. Or if you can afford private school, you'll go to school. But the idea that this is somehow wonderful, has elevated school. I mean, look at Jamaica, look at the Caribbean, look at the levels of poverty. If that's the result of British school system, you know it's perpetuated racism, right? So the role of schooling in the colonies was always to give the few, some of the lucky others, the top of us, a role, was to train us into supplication. Was to train us into supplication. Was to train us into neo-colonialism. That's how you maintain a colony, right? You train the people who run the colony, and then they run the colony exactly how you want them to run the colony. All these great leaders of independence, they were basically handed over the place. Here, have Jamaica, hey, have Nigeria, have it. Because you're gonna run it the same way we run it. So they're trained in neo-colonial economics. They're trained in structural adjustment, and they're trained in corruption. We like to blame Africa for corruption. These leaders were blaming for corruption, the leaders that our school system has taught. Right? There's basically a conveyor belt that goes from the third world through institutions like this, the people who can afford it, and they get trained into neo-colonial economics, and that's why the countries are as poor as they are today, because the British school system teaches the people who run those countries. This is how the British school system perpetuates racism. That is the heart of racism, that the West is superior, the West is best, and all these other poor countries, you just have to supplicate yourselves
Point of information here.
Supplicate yourselves to us. And the evidence of this is clear, because this isn't just a struggle, and I end on this. This isn't just a struggle here Rose must fall starts in where? South Africa, British schooling system. Jamaica, they're having these same arguments. And the young people today are waking up and saying, no, the days where you can do this are long gone. The British education system has been the enemy of advancement and the enemy of black and brown people for too long. And just to paraphrase Malcolm X to finish, the days are long gone when we allow the enemy to educate our children. Thank you.